And welcome everyone to this installment of UnSpun, episode number 10. And today, Joe and I have an interesting show for all of you. And we're going to be actually, the show is going to be essentially the trial of Ken Kesey. And Zane Kesey, Ken Kesey's son, contacted me, about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, swearing at me, saying that his dad was not a CIA agent. So Joe wrote Zane because right after Zane name called at me, he blocked me so that I couldn't respond to him. But Joe wrote Zane inviting him to be a guest on the show tonight and didn't get a response so that Zane can stand for his father. But we're going to be presenting the evidence, at least much of the evidence that we've gathered over the last several years that Ken Kesey was in fact a CIA agent. So you want to go from there, Joe?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll say is that the standard of CIA agent is not necessarily what, in my opinion, Kesey can be convicted of, because the organization that puts on something as vast as the creation of the counterculture and the debasement of the whole generation of young people spreads across a lot of organizations. And in what we're going to be doing today when we go through some of the associations that Kesey has, for example, the Grateful Dead and the Merry Pranksters, we're going to show that the Freemasons are involved. That basically that the quite a few members of the Grateful Dead were what could be called Masonic agents. They were agents of Freemasonry. Another key individual is a Bohemian Grove member. Kesey is among all of the people, Jan, that we have identified as being part of the plot to create the counterculture. Kesey has one of the hardest backgrounds to pin down. In other words, if you look at like the rock and roll stars that McGowan called out from Laurel Canyon, basically what he noticed is that every one of them had a father or family member who was in military intelligence. So that cluster is very easy to identify. These are the sons and daughters of military intelligence, and that's their basically, how they were established as candidates to become rock and roll stars and lead people into drug taking. In the Grateful Dead, you have, Bohemian Grove, you have Freemasonry. Again, it's very easy to identify these secret societies that are being used as, it's kind of the overarching control of the destruction of of a generation of America's youth. But Kesey is actually, his background doesn't have, as far as I can tell, Freemasonry, the Bohemian Grove. He was employed by the CIA. I mean, this is not disputed. He was paid as what he claims as to be a volunteer.
He was experimented on by the CIA.
He was experimented
and
on.
He was, well, that's the official story, and then paid for that.
Exactly, yeah. So this is the official story. But that's different than, for example, like the Grateful Dead members who have, they are outed Freemasons, they are outed Bohemian Grove members. Alexander Shulgin, who is the chemist that was training Osley and Cargill, who were then going to be producing the LSD. I mean, he is a well-known Bohemian Grove member. And then I also reference another source. You have banking families. For example, Billy Hitchcock and Cargill, Stanley Osley's girlfriend, who was a chemist that was helping to create the LSD. These are, some of the most famous financial families in America, the Mellons and the Cargills. So that's another point from which people can enter into the plot. In other words, you have the Mellon family, which basically ran the OSS during World War II. There's a lot of documentation on this. The Cargill family, and then even Osley Stanley, I mean, his family, he was the person who actually finished the LSD and then gave it to the Grateful Dead. He was the grandson of a, Kentucky governor. And a family that's connected into Freemasonry. And in the case of Owsley, he checked himself in at St. Elizabeth Hospital for 18 months as a young boy, like 15, 16 years old. And this was at the exact time that MKUltra was there doing experiments at the hospital. So you can see in his case, again, you have these direct connections. But in Kesey's case, you don't have it. And I was discussing Kesey's guilt, which incidentally I am absolutely positive of. All right, so just to get that on the table, Jan, I don't have any question about it.
I have zero question about it as well.
Okay,
I've researched him for 3 or 4 years.
I don't have any question at all. And I also think that we're going to make an overwhelming case. But the person I was talking to said, well, wait a second. What if Kesey was one of the victims? In other words, when you create a social movement, you are anticipating that you will sweep up useful idiots and gather them in, turn their minds, and then, basically use them to go forward and spread out. That's the whole purpose. But in Kesey's case, this is not possible because Kesey was seminal. In other words, when he wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, there was no counterculture to plug it into. Kesey wrote a book which has as its theme that the world is insane and only crazy people can be free, right? So this obviously is connected into the counterculture. It sets the seeds for the counterculture. There wasn't any momentum to bring Kesey into this. He had to have these principles before they were actually started by himself, because Cuckoo's Nest was written probably between 1959 and 60. This is the time when he was at Stanford when Kesey was at Stanford on a scholarship, and purportedly he was at the Palo Alto VA getting the LSD from Gregory Bateson. Okay,
and both Stanford and Palo Alto, which is the town, the city up in Northern California, both heavily involved in MKUltra.
So I'm going to turn it over to you in 1 second. I just wanted to make this point that the logical argument that Kesey is possible as someone who is a useful idiot and not someone who is actually inside the deal is incorrect, because if you look at the circumstances, the social circumstances of 1959 and 60, when Cuckoo's Nest was being written, there was no strong cultural current that would have swept him up. And you can see that the book is completely and transparently a seeding the ground. It's preparing the culture for what's going to come next. We'll get into that later on. But anyway, that's my initial point in terms of Kesey.
Okay, so there's a lot of evidence here, but yeah, I agree with you, Joe, that the useful idiot bit is untenable in Kesey's case because there's just too much overwhelming evidence. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play a clip from Timothy Leary from the Reunion Party, which you and I have covered extensively. This is from a conversation on LSD, and I'm going to play the video here so that people can see this, and we can go from there. So this is at roughly 35 minutes into it, and I'm going to have to, I don't have a feed directly through. I don't have it set up for that.
I want to point out that that's Tim Leary on the right, and that's
Tim Leary on the right, and that's Al Hubbard in the uniform right here. This is the
and
Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
And both are CIA employees. Both are CIA employees.
He was, Al Hubbard was OSS originally and then joined the CIA, and he is one of the key figures behind the MKUltra program. Of course, Leary was as well, but we'll also see Sidney Cohen, another CIA agent, sitting on the left here. And I'm going to move my microphone up so you all can hear it.
And of course, it was part of the coolness of the Los Angeles cell, whatever you want to call it. that they kept a, you kept a...
Would you mind not calling it a cell? Let's call it a cluster.
Our undercover agents in Los Angeles were very cool about, and yet they did more in a very laid-back way. And it's never been as public as some of the other, the buses running around the country.
Yeah, I think Zinberg says that the visionary experience and all the things he was doing at Harvard and the others, his residents and the rest of his giving LSD to, they never had a visionary or ecstatic or mystic experience, but the whole thing was a California invention.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So that's a good place to take a break there. Now we hear Leary admitting that our undercover agents, and then he talks about was every bit as well. I have the transcript right here. So he says our undercover agents were every bit as cool about, and yet they did more in a very laid back way, and it's every bit as public as some of the other, the buses running around the country. And of course, he's referring to Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. Now, Tim Leary admits that he was an agent, a witting agent from 1962, and it appears that he was probably brought into research for Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond for the CIA in around 1957 when the Harvard Psychedelic Research Project was launched. Now, this quote here is very clearly identifying Leary, and then Leary is saying that, and by the way, everybody in that video that we just saw was an agent. So Leary is identifying Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters as agents. He doesn't say Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters as agents, but he says it's every bit as public as the buses going around the country, but he does identify our undercover agents. So this is one of the first pieces of evidence, and I want to bring up some additional evidence with Ken Kesey from the brain, because Ken Kesey's first dose, now he goes to Palo Alto. He's working at at Stanford, but he's at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital there, and he's getting this LSD experiments done on him. That's the official story anyway, which I'm not sure I believe, from none other than Gregory Bateson. Now, of course, we've exposed Gregory Bateson repeatedly on this show and on the Gnostic Media podcast, etc. He was one of the key founders of the CIA. So, in fact, the key founder. So the key founder of the CIA is who dosed Ken Kesey. Now, well, and I don't want to get too far ahead, so let's jump from there, Joe. You want to take it over from there?
Well,
why don't you speak up just a little bit?
All right, sure. So I wanted to go back to the video first and point out that there are known members of the MKUltra project that are inside that video. So in other words, the video, when you look at Leary's talking about our agents, it's the language may seem a little cryptic to the listener, but the fact is that this is a CIA cluster. You have MKUltra agents. You have people that are OSS agents. That's Sidney Cohen.
That's Sidney Cohen,
outed MKUltra individual. And so when Leary uses the expression our cluster, our agents,
he says our cell, and then Sidney Cohen says, why don't we call it a cluster?
Right. And then he says that we did more than the buses going around the country. What it is, it's really in this context. There's no way he could be saying anything other than Kesey was inside the organization. See, this is what Leary's statement can only mean. There's just no other logical way to interpret it. He's saying that Kesey was in this cluster. And so Kesey, after writing the Cuckoo's Nest, he hooked up with Ken Babbs, and Babbs then is a sound engineer, just like Osley Stanley. Okay, so they are both military trained sound engineers. Kesey, in a way that isn't completely clear, there isn't actually a good documentation of it. He hooks up with what becomes the Grateful Dead. Now, this it kind of unifies with the Pranksters, this organization that he had started. And now you start putting on the what's called the acid tests. Kesey starts up this phenomena, which really is the vehicle by which LSD becomes commonly used. Before this time, LSD is strictly a CIA project. In other words, the CIA is using it. You have Gordon Wasson in 1957 discovering so-called the magic mushroom. Then you have a series of experiments by the CIA and some of them in this project MKUltra, giving LSD to people who are unaware that they're taking it. They dose an entire village in Europe to see what the results are. And then the acid tests began. And so just from the perspective of just simple logic, you have Kesey involved with the CIA. You have Kesey involved with Gregory Bateson. These are the individuals that had been overseeing the dispensing of LSD, and often to people who don't know they're taking it. And then you have Kesey starting the acid tests. So the first kind of point of understanding is that the acid tests that Kesey started and created, they should be understood as just another iteration of what the CIA was doing. This is just the operation that goes public. Everything else had been testing the drug, understanding the drug, getting the drug into the public domain. They had been giving it to unwitting individuals and studying them. But finally, with the acid test, they go completely public. They are now, and because Kesey has all of these connections into the CIA, because he first is given the drug by Bateson, and because he claims at the very least that he was someone paid in the LSD experiments. So now you have him giving out LSD. Well, LSD is a very expensive thing to make at this point. Kesey doesn't have a lot of money, and yet somehow there's always plenty of LSD to give away for free. So this is the first point, is that the natural way to understand the acid tests that Kesey created were that they are just part of the CIA's project. And what I'm going to say is that if, in other words, you can show that there was an organized project to create the counterculture, right? And there's much evidence to demonstrate this, then Kesey is automatically guilty. Because to argue that Kesey was simply someone who wrote a book that stated that the world was a prison and only sane people could be free, and then created the acid tests.
Or only crazy people could be free.
Only crazy people could be free. This isn't accidental. These are very, very unusual behaviors. They fit perfectly into the pattern of the cultural debasement that Gregory Bateson described in when he was doing the anthropologic research during World War II as a way to control people, to enslave people. Kesey's behavior fits perfectly into that context. It makes no sense at all to think, well, he just happened to have these attributes.
So, Ken Kesey, he's okay. So then he goes on, and then he's selling the same theme that the CIA is essentially selling, the counterculture and psychedelic revolution. And Joe and I exposed this in our article, Manufacturing the Deadhead, as well as my subsequent and prior articles to that. And then I've done about probably 100 shows on MKUltra, on my podcast, et cetera, going into in-depth analysis on a lot of this, but we can see Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters taking on this whole psychedelic theme and promoting the degradation of society. Now, basically, World War II is in it. Now they have the atomic weapon, etc. And what they want to do is blame the common folks for what the government and military apparatus and the elite have created with the atomic weapon. Now, the atomic bomb, that is a word coined by H.G. Wells, whom we've already exposed. H.G. Wells repeatedly shows up in all of this. He's the original founder of transhumanism. He coined the word, or the term, the New World Order. He coined the term, the atomic bomb, etc. He's the one who wrote the War of the Worlds, and of course, I did a War of the Worlds episode on Halloween for the Gnostic Media podcast. This is all H.G. Wells tying into these themes. So what they want to do then is this group of people, they develop these themes, and then they have the intelligence community sell it. But then what they're going to do is they're going to turn it and blame the regular folks out there for then what they themselves created. So, H.G. Wells, of course, taught Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley writes The Brave New World, which becomes the psychedelic revolution. And so this is their answer for the atomic bomb that H.G. Wells was behind the creation of.
Well, remember, the atomic bomb was actually, even though it's, they talk about the Manhattan Project, if you actually do research into it, the atomic bomb was designed and basically the project was created at the Bohemian Grove. It wasn't even a U.S. government project. In fact, this is one of the really proud declarations that the Bohemian Grove makes about itself, is that they were the institution that actually brought everyone together to create the atomic terror bomb to scare the population. Going back to those pictures of the Merry Pranksters, which incidentally is
Here, I just wanted to show this really quick so people can follow up on my recent episode with the Collins brothers, Blackmailed by the Bomb, Nuclear Anxiety, and the Cult of the Superweapon. And we do go into H.G. Wells there as well.
Yeah, well, good. Well, anyway, so the thing is, when you look at the pranksters, you see the bus. This is the bus that Larry was referring to that drove around. The pranksters had a very particular way of dressing, kind of as though they were crazy, but fun with colors. And so, you have to think about, well, what's in back of this? And, it's fairly easy to understand that these are the images that are going to be used to take young people into a magic world, a fantasy world, right? The purpose for that is once they've shifted them over into a fantasy world, then they are, obviously easier to control. And when I was looking through the chronology of all this, Sean, I realized that they had carefully timed all of the events, the Beatles, Gordon Wasson's trip, because they understood when the demographic bulge of the baby boomer would be at its greatest. And everything was back calculated from that, so that at exactly the time the baby boomer was 18 and the most impressionable, and this was when the largest fraction of this huge generation of European American kids who were obviously the focus of all this, at the exact moment that the bulge was at the biggest teenage point, and when the boomer is 18, that was when when you had the maturation of all of these themes. So you can see that that the Beatles were timed, and the Grateful Dead were timed. The rock and roll scene that went on, started in like 65 and 66 in Laurel Canyon. There was actually a chronology that had been established by this organization as to when they wanted to really bring the publicity of the LSD and the drug taking and the rock and roll music to a zenith. And obviously Woodstock was the point they were heading to. This was the summer of love. Woodstock was when they were going to have, the maximum damage done, because at that point, LSD was really being promoted as a, wonderfully spiritual adventure. And it had completely taken over the culture. I mean, everyone was dressing kind of like hippies. People were having longer hair, males having longer hair. And the clothing that the pranksters had developed, you'd see it everywhere. And of course, in Los Angeles, we have Zal Palakas, who is also producing this kind of
Sue,
Sue Palakas was producing this clown. It's like basically a clown outfit, kind of appearance. And so, all of these things were woven together. We think, we look back, well, it's simply history unfolding, but this is preposterous. These people all knew each other. They were, the great majority of them were, from either military intelligence or Freemason or Bohemian Grove. And so the whole thing is being obviously, brought into existence. I mean, you look at these videos. This was the dancing that was going on in the Sunset Strip. This was the dancing that Vito Palakas and Sue were promoting with their clothes, and
they were working with Leary and the Dead and everybody else. Sue basically is the one who developed the clothing design look, or the look and the dance. Well, Vito the dance, and this is Sue here, but she basically created the whole look for them.
Right, and this is like Sue. The Laurel Canyon look is a little different than what was going on in San Francisco. San Francisco, the pranksters were, because the name prankster comes from this kind of, it basically it's a German. Originally, it was the German version of Puck, the character from Shakespeare. So they have this appearance is slightly more clown-like than what was going on in Laurel Canyon, but they are very, very similar. And the two counterculture cells merge eventually as you go through time. But anyway, it was all designed to basically introduce a drug that produced psychosis as something that was recreational. And so in my experience, I had 5 or 6 people that had, psychically traumatic experiences with the drug. And this was a large fraction of the people that I knew and hung out with. So it was very, very devastating. And of course, when you think about these people, Jan, on the bus, and I guess we're going away from Kesey here, but
yeah, and I'm looking for an image of Puck to show people.
What they're like. But anyway, so what you're going to see is that that these images are done to take people away from behavior and a culture that would be something that would ever threaten the oligarchs, you see. I mean, this is, when you think about the people on the bus, when you think about their philosophy of turn on, tune in, drop out, their behavior, their clothes, their drug taking, they're of no danger to anyone. They're literally not, they're not going to produce families. And remember that the family production came to a screeching stop right here. This was exactly where it ends, because if you look at family production demographics, you'll see that with Woodstock, with this culture, with the sexual liberation and with the drug taking, it just ends right here. I mean, when I came for my 20th reunion, less than a third of my class, and this was Pacific Palisades High School, so it's, middle class high school.
Just make sure you're in the camera there a little bit.
Okay. Less than a third of my class had children, right? So this was basically what you're seeing was an effective assault upon family production, upon a culture that would have values that would create strength. So this is what really, this was what it was about. It was Kesey's, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is, one of the very first thrusts against this generation. And it was a book that I had to read. It was on the mandatory reading list, in high school.
Yeah.
And so, this, you can see what happened, and you can see the role that Kesey played in it.
All right, so let's get into some of the additional evidence regarding Kesey. Now, within the brain database, everything in red is pretty much not just red. I would say that people in red are high-level CIA agents. People in yellow are pretty up there. People in white, maybe we just haven't spent as much time flushing them out. But the people in red, we've pretty well flushed out. Now, Ken Kesey was lovers with who is now Dorothy Fadiman. Now, Dorothy Fadiman today makes Agenda 21 films for the United Nations. After she left the Merry Pranksters, she ended up marrying a guy by the name of Dr. James Fadiman. And I've exposed James Fadiman. He was on my podcast years ago, and I've since exposed him. I exposed him on Facebook in front of everyone, and he tried to sit there and slander me and use his psychology background to gaslight and all of this stuff. But James Fadiman worked on changing images of man for the Stanford Research Institute with people like B.F. Skinner, Carl Rogers, who developed neurolinguistic programming that went on to go into nonviolent communication. Carl Rogers headed MKULTRA Subproject 97. And so he actually taught people like William Thetford, who wrote The Course in Miracles. William Thetford was MKULTRA Subproject 89 and 69. And so we also see Marshall Rosenberg was a student there who created nonviolent communication. But these guys, this is the core of MKUltra. Now, this Changing Images of Man project is very important, and it's a tight little knit group that we're looking at, and it might seem unrelated, but we see also involved in this was Ralph Metzner, who also worked with Leary at the Millbrook Mansion, which was funded by the Mellon banking family with Peggy Mellon Hitchcock. We see Joseph Campbell, the famous mythologist. He was actually the main guy in charge of Changing Images of Man, and I would say that Joseph Campbell was a key figure in creating the subsequent cults that came out of the 60s MKUltra program. But another thing with James Fadiman is he's also the last legal person to do LSD research in the United States. And he's also today the same guy who is out there promoting all of this microdosing that we're seeing pop up in the media a lot lately. This is James Fadiman. And I have vetted him as intelligence, and he says that he studied theater at Harvard. Of course, everybody goes to Harvard to study theater because, well, obviously you need to be a good actor to be a lifetime agent or a lifetime actor.
I want to just interject something, and this shows the real power of the brain, because I began doing research into the counterculture because I was asked to do analysis on A Course in Miracles. And notice that Jan very nimbly just went from Kesey to A Course in Miracles. And there is absolutely no reason in the world that individuals that would produce The Course in Miracles, which is, of course, an insane religious position, this woman was claiming to be channeling Jesus, right? And yet you could see that as Jan went through the database, that the Course in Miracles was very closely related and through these individuals to Ken Kesey. Now, when you look at A Course in Miracles, you have another way to debase the intellect. You are taking people into magical thinking, into believing that Jesus is channeling, in other words, a neo-Jesus. You have a new gospel.
Well, Helen Schuckman was channeling Jesus.
Right.
A Jewish woman channeling Jesus.
Right. But you see, again, this is just like Kesey's acid tests. This takes people to an irrational place, a place where they can't defend themselves against the sophistry of the oligarchs. So the fact that things as unrelated, seemingly, as the pranksters and Kesey and A Course in Miracle can now, through the brain, be shown to be completely and directly related, shows you that there is an organization, and that this is really the first plank of the conviction of Kesey. Because, as I said before, if the organization did exist, if it was exchanging information among itself in terms of creating this debased culture, then obviously Kesey was part of it because of his both creating the acid test and his writing Cuckoo's Nest. And here, ladies and gentlemen, we have just proven it, because it is just impossible, in my opinion, to argue that there would be some natural connection between A Course in Miracle and the Merry Pranksters. And yet, if you go through this brain, you'll see that there were direct.
Right. Well, Ken Kesey's lover, Dorothy, who became Dorothy Fadiman,
right.
She married James Fadiman, who worked with the Stanford Research Institute, which of course was MKUltra. He's one of the people that developed the computer mouse, and he worked on changing images of man with all of these CIA and intelligence community personnel. Now, Willis Harriman, another key person, but we see Al Hubbard that we just showed in the video. We see Tim Leary, Oscar Janiger, Sidney Cohen. All of these people were just in the video that we showed, all of them relating directly and indirectly to changing images of man. Margaret Mead, who was, of course, Gregory Bateson's wife. Gregory Bateson founded the CIA. She is also working on changing images of man. So we see all of these themes and these peddling of these New Age religions and cults from the same group. Now, another thing that's very interesting is when we look at the Merry Pranksters, and let me just get back to that. When we look at the Merry Pranksters here, we see a lot of these people go on to write books or become very famous. Now, let's say you're cruising around in a bus, smoking joints and dropping acid and doing mushrooms with your buddies. How many of you are going to become famous film directors, authors, etc.? So we've got Stuart Brand. He becomes an author. He creates the Whole Earth catalog. Again, Dorothy Fadiman. She goes on to work with the UN and create UN films. We have Paul Krasner in there. All of these people, and he was also at Millbrook, but all of these people go on to become famous authors, etc. Here's Tom Wolfe that wrote the electric acid Kool-Aid test, etc. So most of these people that were with the Merry Pranksters get very famous. Here's Neil Cassidy.
Right. And I just want to interject something. When you think about the changing images of man, and then you think about the Merry Pranksters, you can see, again, you have a clear relationship, because the changing images of man sets up an intellectual structure where completely brand new behavior and ways of operating can exist. And then you look at the pranksters. They are a manifestation of this idea. Right? They are literally, a changed image of man. They are dressing different. They're talking different. Their social structure is different. And when you look at A Course in Miracle, it's basically the same thing. You are adopting a new magical thinking. A changing image of Christianity, in this case, of a Christian, is being given. So all of these things are related. They have the appearance of social science. But no, the social science is in back of them. The social science is what Gregory Bateson developed in World War II in terms of how to enslave populations. This is social science in action. These are not projects to develop social science. This is subtly shifting culture. And this is, in fact, exactly the effect that all of these people in total had. They changed us. They damaged us. They made us more prone to believe in sophist ideas and magical thinking.
More prone to hypersuggestibility.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was the point in promoting the drugs. And as I exposed in my article, Entheogens, What's in a Name, the drugs do cause suggestibility. So this is really what they were going for in this. And I do recommend that people read this article. I used to believe in the psychedelic religious experience, and then I dug in and I went through and checked all of the citations, and the result was this article going through and exposing who created which words and the whole history of it. So there were basically two teams that created all of the words that we use for psychedelics today. Originally, they were called schizophrenogens, psychotomimetics, which means to mimic psychosis. And today, or later on, they were changed to psychedelic, and then today they're promoting the word entheogen. And in between, there is the word hallucinogen. But Humphrey Osmond created the words psychedelic and psychotomimetic, and he was part of Team 1 with Aldous Huxley. Of course, we've shown repeatedly that Aldous Huxley was one of the heads of MKUltra, and all roads lead to the Huxley family when we're researching all this stuff, and we just see all the red everywhere here with Aldous.
Right, and I wanted to point out that you hear that photograph shows Huxley representing the one eye.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that comment.
Right. I mean, one of the ways you can identify these people, one of the ways that they communicate between each other is with this one eye business, because it's one of the critical images of Freemasonry, and so they do it cryptically, like Huxley is doing in that picture, so that he's representing not just Freemasonry but a high level, right? Because there's something secret. Now, bear in mind that when you look at the handwritten poster of the very first acid test that Kesey put on, which had the Warlocks as the house band. This was before the Grateful Dead had that name. You have this handwritten poster which has the all-seeing eye right on the top as its central image.
Yeah, did I put that? You know what? I'm thinking I didn't save that image.
Well, I'll give the next week. We'll bring the link.
And we should add that Zane Kesey, and this is from Vice magazine, but last year, Zane Kesey relaunched this whole thing again and went across country doing his dad's quote unquote legendary bus trip to go around again promoting the CIA's agenda. Now, it's possible that Zane is ignorant or just completely unaware of his father's actions and involvement in this stuff. And we've hardly even gone through a lot of the evidence that we have, like ties to the Esalen Institute. I mean, he's involved with so many CIA personnel and known MKUltra researchers, and influenced by William Sargent, who wrote Battle for the Mind. And that becomes the Fourth World Battle for the Mind, which folds out into all of these different agendas that we're selling. But, it's very possible that Zane is unaware of his father's intelligence work, but it's very clear and very obvious that Ken Kesey was selling the official agenda for the CIA.
Right.
And we see again the theme being played out in Kesey's book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Right. And this is the stumbling block for Zane. And I do hope he comes on the show, because I think it would be very valuable for the audience to actually hear an exchange with us and Zane. But what I think that Zane will not be able to overcome is the fact that there was an organized effort to debase culture. And once that principle is agreed to, and I don't know Zane, I have no communication with him, but I'm assuming he's an honest individual.
Well, he had a lot of name calling to say at me.
Well, hopefully he can recover from that infantile perspective and
Right.
get into, a little more reasonable discourse. But anyway, let's just assume that he comes in with an open mind and he argues as best he can. The problem with his position is that if you accept the fact that the organization existed and this was basically a project, and here from the primary documents from Bateson's describing the archaic revival as a way to control people to, for God's sakes, Wasson's pay requisition with MKUltra to go to Mexico. And then, people like Hubbard and Larry and all of the other individuals that were part of this that all can be traced directly to the CIA or to the Bohemian Grove or to Freemasonry. Now you have all of these secret societies in orchestra. And you can't then take Kesey and say, well, he wasn't part of it. It just isn't a position that is rational. He was part of it. I don't know, because I haven't been able to find in his family background the connection into a secret society or to know how exactly they chose him for his part, but they did. And it was before he came to Stanford. In other words, obviously the scholarship that he received was like the scholarship that Gloria Steinem got. It was just something that the CIA did to create some funding and an opportunity for him to be in the right place at the right time. And the introductions to the Grateful Dead and the introductions to Alexander Shulgin, the introductions to Osley.
Shulgin, you got it right the first time.
Sorry. These introductions were obviously orchestrated. These are the individuals that as a cluster created the acid tests, which brought LSD into America's common culture. And Kesey was an orchestrator of it. So he had been selected for some reason, and then he did execute the plan.
I agree. All right. So we've got about 12 minutes before we wrap it up here. We should probably go into whatever other details we can add to this. What do you think we should touch on here, Joe?
Well, I'd like to point out that there is a YouTube video, which is actually has video. It has images, but it's
now,
an audio tape.
You had just sent me that too, and I meant to have it up, and
there's an audio tape of Ken Kesey's first LSD experiment, and
yes,
and this is very damning. This is very damning evidence because, first of all, the tape purports that Kesey, who was the subject of a CIA experiment, was in control of the tape recording.
Right. Now, basically, yeah, essentially, yeah, he was, or that the CIA would have released the audio for one of their secret
and then
experiments.
What is completely convincing is that Kesey at the end of it starts talking about the strobe lights he's seeing. All right, now this is something that everyone can understand very, very simply. The strobe lights never were associated with LSD until the merry pranksters began using them in the acid tests. There were no strobe lights in the CIA's experiments. So when Kesey makes reference to the strobe lights, which he does at the end of this video that he's seeing, he is basically taking an idea from the pranksters. So in other words, the audio was made after the fact. This is not a real audio of an LSD.
Absolutely.
That he had, because these MKUltra, the ones that this claims that Kesey is making his statements from.
And we should probably play some of this.
Right, but this would have occurred before 1963. You see, these would have been probably this would had to have been between 1958 and 1959, and this was years before the pranksters ever brought the strobe lights and rock and roll music to the LSD.
Right. So, and the interesting part is, it's like Kesey's planning this, and people just nod along with this.
Right.
video here, but it's clear that he's planning the idea. Yeah, you know, strobe lights and rock and roll.
Strobe lights, rock and roll, and then at the end it talks about love, and you have to have this transcendent love. So in other words, this was made as basically as a promotion piece for the agenda that he was pushing long after the claims that he makes in terms of an MKUltra experiment. So in other words, this tape is a complete lie. It's a fraud. And this was done by Kesey in his own voice. And he claims that this is, you know, his experience that he has during the MKUltra experiments he did.
Right, by Gregory Bateson, the founder of the CIA.
So,
so this is all staged, but I want to play this audio, Joe.
Sure.
You feel pretty good about the whole thing and kind of open, just waiting to see what happens.
That's right.
That's very good. Definitely a good experiment.
The machine here to the left is all concrete gears of electricity. I keep thinking that I should hear from it. I feel fairly drunk, like I'm lying on the back with the whirlies. They're down. Light at the top of the room is like a great eye, to which is the optic nerve.
Rock and roll, great eye.
You're overloading the sound there.
Sheath style costume, probably because the belly around her middle is beginning to be blue and overhanging, and she has to cover that blue, rolly flesh. It's like looking at Rochard test and seeing mashed testicles. It's quite a one. That's high out of my mind. Wild color images. There's this big colored frog of a man outside standing at the door like some guy's room when the guy's all teetering on the bed. And the guy goes, hey man. This is what's the most insane thing. If you realize how much the one second microphone looks like a shaver. Woolen sack. Woolen sack. What a thought. Also the trouble with you as a tape recorder. You waiting toad. Look at you there. You don't realize how much you look like this toad. From where I lay, I could see the unwinding reel. Since your brain without what you just, you don't even call it toad anymore. It's dead thing, which if you loaded with new brain, I can see it unwinding. Therefore, I'm going to shut you off because we're losing too much of your brain. Yeah.
How are you feeling right now? Do you seem to feel there's still some effect of the drug?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I told you about the strobe light. It was so great.
Right. Strobe lights.
You can't do that yet. Hold on.
Concentric going into the strobe light. Bats and eggs and everything cascading into the strobe light. The man next door was playing his band rock and roll. And this would have an effect. Very discordant in color.
It affected the imagery. You mentioned two things, bats and eggs. Were there other things you would see going in?
Well, there are more mathematical patterns, hexagons and pentagons and mummies and things that you might find on the pyramid wall.
Is that uncomfortable or comfortable?
I think it's a good experience. I think anytime you see more, especially if you have the basic inherent love of people.
All you need is love.
And when I came out of it, I felt like it was like discovering a hole that went into the center of the earth, and you could see.
Turn it off. He makes me sick to my stomach. Well, that's just a complete tip to stern fraud. It's an absolute lie. Strobe lights, rock and roll,
Pyramids.
Pyramids. I mean, that's the free. He does a lot of cryptic Freemason imagery.
Yep.
He throws that stuff in, but then he focuses on the strobe lights. See, he's seeding the ground for people to take the drugs under these absurd conditions that they were doing later on with the strobe lights and the rock and roll. But in 1958 and 9, when he was actually doing these experiments, he claims there were no strobe lights and rock and roll associated with LSD. That's absolute nonsense. So, and I'll also say, Jan, you've taken LSD. I have. I've never, and I've known lots of people who've taken it. I've never heard anyone talk like this. The first, when I was in high school, I had done an LSD a bunch of times and mushrooms before I ever had my first quote unquote religious experience. Now, the first time I did ever have a quote unquote religious or spiritual experience just happened to be the night after I met, it was the same night that I met Timothy Leary and Dennis McKenna. And, before then, the idea that this was a religious experience had never occurred to me. So the idea had to be seeded to me or suggested to me. Right. And then I started having these subsequent experiences after that fact. It's just like, I showed the article earlier in Theogen's What's in a Name. These ideas had to be marketed. So they, the words psychedelic and entheogen were marketing ploys to get people to begin to have this so-called religious experience so that they could, so that the CIA could market this system of mind control as a so-called spiritual experience. They basically remarketed the psychotic break as a spiritual experience. Exactly. And then, I'd really like to know what Zane's response would be when we point out that there is no way his father could have had a strobe light rock and roll experience, and that there are too many Freemason images. Notice he talked about the great eye on the ceiling, and then you have the mummies and the things on the pyramids. I mean, that's just cryptic Mason talk that he's putting out, just alerting the brethren, what absolutely the back of all this thing. So, and then of course the absurdity of like a patient who's doing an LSD experiment being in charge of the tape recorder. I mean, that's just preposterous. That could, and then not only that, but they show the sound of the tape recorder being turned on, even though it's already recording him. Right. And then the other thing is, look, where are the other tapes? I mean, first of all, one thing I really want to find is a roster of all the people who were used as experiments at Palo Alto by MKUltra. Because if the only two people on the list are Robert Hunter and Ken Kesey, then you know that the whole thing is just dirty as hell. Because I want to see some other names. Because we know Hunter did it. We know Kesey did it. And we know Hunter was an agent. Now here's the thing. And Hunter went on to, excuse me a second, Hunter went on to write an article, Why Spy, and talked about all of his work at Langley. And we only have a minute or two left. Okay, so my last point is just, look, if there are other tapes, then we have to get our hands on them so we can show that Kesey's tape is just... But why is this one released? Right. And then if there are no other tapes, then this is just damning evidence. It just shows that this is fake, that this is just a promo piece for LSD. And ladies and gentlemen, that's a wrap. Please support our work at postflaviana.org and gnosticmedia.com. We can't do all of this every week without your donations and support and memberships and book purchases, etc. So please do support everything. Yep. And CaesarsMessiah.com. Please go there. Or postflaviana.org. You can buy my books, and then also support this network. It is a very, very worthwhile, and it's something that we can use to really stand against the oligarchs and the mainstream media. And we'll see you next Tuesday, ladies and gentlemen. Until then. Bye-bye. Thank you, Jan.
The pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world should be the focus of every person on our planet. The reason it is not is because people are kept distracted by the illusions and deceit propagated by the corporately controlled mainstream media. In recent years, the rise in truly informed, savvy researchers and journalists who have all taken to the air in various capacities has given rise to a new genre of media. We have seen the explosion of truly free and independent media, and thus the need to create an ethical live broadcast network that facilitated these brave and tireless souls became apparent. With a great amount of research and meticulous planning, Conscious Consumer Network was created. CCN is a first-of-its-kind broadcast network that is specifically dedicated to free and independent media with absolutely no government control, corporate sponsorship, or advertising. The live broadcast network runs full-time with an average of 25 shows and live broadcasts a week. The high-definition live stream is free to view and is accessible from any computer terminal with online access, including laptops, tablets, smartphones, and smart TVs. All shows are archived onto YouTube and are freely available to view in order to educate and inform as many as we can without imposing monetary limitations. CCN was successfully launched on the 1st of January 2015 and has gone from strength to strength as we have improved and increased the capacities and functionalities of the network, as well as an ever-rotating and improving lineup of content which is broadcast daily. CCN is blessed to be the home of some of the hardest-hitting, most cutting-edge, truly educational and informative materials. Catch interviews, reviews, and talk shows from the many different and beautiful perspectives from CCN's family of interviewers and broadcasters. Since the 1st of January 2015, we have produced over 800 shows. We have over 2 million YouTube minutes watched every month, and we have an average of 1 million hits a day on CCN's website. CCN is viewed in over 147 different countries and hosts broadcasters from 5 different continents. The time has now come to generate funding to keep CCN on the air for the duration of 2016. The total sum needed to continue broadcasting for 2016 is $60,000. This budget includes the replacement of computer equipment, the acquisition of secure servers, which are most needed as we keep getting hacked, plus the renewal of the broadcast license fee for 2016. This is a fraction of the annual budget used by mainstream media networks producing a similar quantity of content. This is what makes CCN so successful, unique, and accessible, is the ability to run a project of this size and reach on such minimal resources. CCN does not claim ownership over any of the material we produce and broadcast, as we firmly believe that information is the common heritage of all beings, and thus CCN belongs to you, the public, and it is up to you all to keep CCN going. CCN would like to thank those who have contributed to the network in the past with resources, content, information, time, and energy. We thank you for supporting free and independent media.